Greetings, this is Tony Arend, and this is SFS Online and On Topic. This webinar series brings distinguished members of the Georgetown faculty and distinguished alumni to talk about the most critical issues of our day. It is produced by the Georgetown University Alumni Association in collaboration with the Walsh School of Foreign Service. And I apologize for some of the technical difficulties, but we are in a virtual world and those things do actually happen. Well, our topic for today is why multilateral disarmament matters. And one of the things that I've noticed over the past 10 or 20 years is many in the United States and elsewhere tend to forget that there are still nuclear weapons in the world. There are still weapons of mass destruction. There are landmines, there are chemical weapons, there are biological weapons, and there are huge stockpiles of conventional weapons. The disarmament issue hasn't gone away. And when I think about who would be one of the very best people in the world to talk about this issue, the answer is our own alumna, Izumi Nakamitsu. I should say, the Honorable Izumi Nakamitsu. Izumi is the Undersecretary General of the United Nations and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, which means she is the UN's top person on disarmament issues. She did her undergraduate work at Waseda University in Tokyo, and then came to the United States and earned a Master of Science in Foreign Service in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. She has had a distinguished career in both the Japanese Foreign Ministry and also at the United Nations. Just to give you a highlight of some of the things she's done, prior to her current position, she was Assistant Administrator of the Crisis Response Unit at the United Nations Development Program. She also served as the Director of the Asia and Middle East Division of the United Nations Department on Peacekeeping Operations, and she was Director of the Peacekeeping Department's Division of Policy Evaluation and Training for a number of years. She participated in our School of Foreign Service Centennial not too long ago when we were actually still in a real world and had events on campus. So it's an honor to have Izumi with us, to bring her back to the hilltop, even if back to the hilltop is a virtual undertaking these days. And I want to really start off, the question is why does multilateral disarmament matter? And let me pitch that over to you, Izumi. Tell us about what is disarmament, why does it matter, and why does the multilateral nature matter?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you for the invitation. And it's so great to be with Georgetown School of Foreign Service and my fellow graduates and possibly also students still there. So let me just, using some 10-15 minutes in talking about why multilateralism matters through the lens of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And in doing so, I will explore very quickly the history and achievements of multilateral nuclear disarmament before actually discussing the current impasse, if you will, facing the multilateral disarmament and attempts to, our collective attempts to overcome it. And I would also try and conclude by offering some thoughts about the way forward. Now, two overarching points to start with. Here at the United Nations, we look at disarmament as a security instrument. It's not some, ideological utopian efforts to create a peaceful world. Quite the contrary, it's a very practical instrument for security. And number two, disarmament regime is actually composed of a mix of multilateral, both at the United Nations, outside the United Nations, some at the regional level, etc. And bilateral, obviously very important. I would say the most important still in the nuclear field is US-Russia bilateral relations. In some occasions, unilateral policy declarations and the norms that we collectively try to make. So it's a mixture of all these different kinds of instruments that's called disarmament regime. Now, to begin with, some thoughts about the scale of the problem. While there have been significant reductions in the number of nuclear weapons, at the height of the Cold War, there were more than 70,000 nuclear arsenals. Today, we still have some 13,400 or so remain in the world. And majority of all these arsenals held today are much more powerful than those that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you can actually, think about a potential risk, which we don't think about on a daily basis, but it's definitely there. So no wonder then some people have characterized nuclear weapons as one of the two existential threats facing humanity. One is, of course, climate change, and the other one is the nuclear explosions. So that's why we still keep nuclear disarmament as one of the top priorities at the United Nations. Now, very quickly, a history. UN, as you all know, was founded shortly after the atomic devastation on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, now this year, 76 years ago, as part of really humanity's determination, renewed by the Second World War and the conclusion of it, to establish conditions for an enduring peace. And January this year, just 2 months ago, we marked 75 years since the very first resolution of the UN General Assembly, which was adopted actually in London because the UN headquarters in New York was still under construction. And that first resolution of the GA envisioned a world free of nuclear weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction. So the total elimination of nuclear weapons has been at the top of disarmament priority that we have. It's in our, I always say, it's in our DNA of the United Nations. Now, another historical achievement, which we celebrated last year, is the 50th anniversary last year of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT. This actually, we can trace its roots to an initiative by a small country, Ireland. They came up with the idea, and it was negotiated at what was then called the 18-Nation Committee on Disarmament. Today, it's expanded, and it's called the Conference on Disarmament, which has not done any negotiation for more than 20 years now. But at that time, they were able to negotiate an NPT. So this, nuclear disarmament, multilateral negotiations at the time really came about as a disarmament negotiation in a step-by-step approach, or some people call it building blocks approach. And steps, included, for example, partial test ban treaty, which was adopted in 1963. And by the way, when some people say that because of the international security environment, it's not the time to discuss and negotiate disarmament, I always use this partial test ban treaty as an example. It's only a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62. It is possible. Historically, it was always possible to discuss and negotiate measures for disarmament. And others included, of course, a threshold test ban treaty, outer space treaty, seabed treaty, and reductions in, nuclear arsenals of, at the time, Soviet Union and, of course, United States through various agreements. And so NPT, since then, it became regarded, really still today, the cornerstone of global nuclear non-proliferation regime and an essential foundation and a pillar of international security. And the reason is its legally binding commitments on nuclear disarmament, Article 6, including 5 nuclear weapon states. And second, its verifiable non-proliferation obligations. And then third, of course, near universal membership, which means that vast majority of countries in the world are bound by these commitments and obligations. So it's a real multilateral treaty as we look at it. The NPT has been, of course, very successful, I would say, or by and large successful, President Kennedy, of course, predicted that there will be up to 25 countries that will have nuclear weapons. It didn't happen. And that is because of how the treaty has been structured and constructed, and by and large, this became a really important part of the international security regime overall. Through its indefinite extension of the NPT in 95, since then we have every 5 years review conferences, which actually became a de facto, if you will, nuclear disarmament negotiation platforms. And we were supposed to have the review conference, of course, last year, which of course had to be postponed, and it's tentatively scheduled for August this year. We will see the COVID situations. Now, in this NPT review conference, in 2000, they agreed on 13 practical steps for nuclear disarmament, which included, and I'm quoting, unequivocal undertaken by the nuclear weapon states to accomplish the total elimination of their nuclear arsenals, leading to nuclear disarmament. Now, 2005, they failed. 2010, however, they at the review conference, they were able to adopt 64-point action plan, which was very comprehensive, significant transparency, accountability, and very concrete measures for the pursuit of nuclear disarmament. Now, since then, of course, things started to go on a stalemate, I would say. For example, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, that was adopted in 1996, still not yet entered into force. Of course, the Conference on Disarmament has not been able to agree to even begin negotiations on the fissile material cutoff treaties. So we're not in a very good situation. Now, fast forward current situation. I think you will all agree that today the international relations really characterized by deteriorating or deteriorated relations among states, especially major powers that possess nuclear weapons. And those same countries are actually assigning increasingly expansive roles to nuclear weapons in their security doctrines, which is a problem. And all states possessing nuclear weapons are modernizing their arsenals. They are investing money. And this, I would say, is both a result of this security environment, but at the same time, it is also a cause for further deterioration of the relationship between those nuclear weapon states. So I would say the danger of nuclear catastrophe is as serious today as it was at the height of the Cold War. That's what we have today. And against this background, also, the multilateral disarmament negotiation platform has been paralyzed, the Conference on Disarmament, and various platforms that we have at the United Nations, also very acrimonious, I would say, very difficult. And of course, 2015, again, NPT review conference was unable to conclude with an outcome. Now, there are some progress. I would touch on the new treaty that just entered into force on 22nd of January of this year. It's the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. Now, this is the first multilateral nuclear disarmament treaty that was adopted in decades. Of course, it is very controversial. None of the nuclear weapon states have even participated in the negotiations, and also their allies as well. But this was really a reflection of a frustration of non-nuclear weapon states at the very slow pace or reversal of nuclear disarmament, and of course the legitimate concerns about the humanitarian and environmental consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. And civil society was very much behind this new treaty, TPNW. I think you will have probably heard that this is very divisive. there are very divergent views about this treaty. Nuclear weapon states are indeed concerned about the efforts through this treaty to stigmatize, prohibit nuclear weapons in arsenals of various countries. And of course, that position has not changed. It's a source of always a disagreement. And I would say at the United Nations, different opposing views are always expressed at various meetings as well. Now, I would say there are two other areas with some progress in nuclear disarmament in recent years, and I will put in here nuclear disarmament verification issues. There have been various multilateral efforts, both outside and inside the United Nations. Now, outside the UN, UK-Norway initiative, the Quad, and more recently, again, this is outside the UN, International Partnership on Nuclear Disarmament Verification, that have been talking about how to come up with standards and methods of verification of nuclear disarmaments. And General Assembly of the UN has now twice tasked the Secretary General to establish and convene groups of governmental experts on the same issue, nuclear disarmament verification. And the first one concluded its work by adopting a good report in 2019. And the second group is now beginning the work later this year. So we are very busy supporting that activities in the context of the United Nations. My last progress area in nuclear disarmament at the multilateral level is there has been increasing attention paid to the question of equal and meaningful participation in disarmament discussions, including in nuclear disarmament forum. And most importantly, I would say, there has been a good focus on important contribution women make in disarmament and the need for not only equal participation, but also leadership and engagement by women in nuclear disarmament negotiations, while taking into account gendered impacts of nuclear weapons. There are different impacts those weapons actually have between men and women and boys and girls. So these are two areas that we see some progress in the multilateral disarmament discussions. Now, to go into way forward, my concluding part. Now, I think one thing that we need to make sure we always remember is that the international community has been able to produce significant cuts in nuclear arsenals. You know, if you compare 70,000 plus to today's number, you know, some 70% reduction was possible at, you know, in nuclear disarmament field, but there are still definitely a long way to go. Now, the recent, of course, 5-year extension of the New START Treaty is an excellent first step, as we always say, you know, following rather worrying erosion, if you will, of the nuclear disarmament arrangements and agreements, most notably, of course, in 2018, the INF Treaty between the United States and Russian Federation. With the 5-year New START extension, we very much hope that we will be able to spend the time, 5 years, to reflect on what are the new approaches and new visions that we need to have for nuclear disarmament in a really much changed international security environment. The world is much more multipolar. There has been a huge and very rapid development of science and technology that would definitely have impacts on those weapons of mass destruction. And there have been also quite a lot of discussions about, you know, how to make sure that ever so increasing military expenditure can be somehow stopped, and then those resources can be put to much needed, for example, a recovery from COVID and health security, etc. After all, there is only limited pot of resources, and it's all about deciding on priorities and allocations. I would like to end here by saying that one of the most important lessons of COVID is that low likelihood events can occur and have really devastating consequences. And therefore, this is a time for all of us to think together and then come up with an effective, more, results-oriented nuclear disarmament regime with multilateral cooperation also at the center, and of course with a primary responsibility to be pursued by the two major superpowers when it comes to nuclear arsenals, which is still US and the Russian Federation, some 90% of arsenals held by the two countries. And we expand these bilateral nuclear arms control and disarmament regimes to expand to other countries or other nuclear weapon states and other, all types of nuclear weapons categories. So I will stop here. In other words, we are looking at the next 5 years as a time of reflection to come up with new vision and a new approach. And we believe that the first step at the multilateral level can and should take place at the 10th NPT review conference, which was postponed to be tentatively scheduled for August this year. And afterwards, we hope to be able to facilitate good substantive discussions and negotiations going forward. So I would stop here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to exchanges with you.
Thank you, Izumi. That was a tour de force on the history of disarmament and where we are now and some of our contemporary challenges. I would encourage people to go into the control panel and write their questions in. I want to just observe one thing that Izumi noted is that even in the midst of the Cold War, arms control was able to proceed. Now, didn't solve the problem, didn't disarm, but things like the Partial Test Ban Treaty was very important. The Seabed Treaty. I was talking in my international law class yesterday about the Outer Space Treaty. That was 1967. And essentially, in that case, it was really the United States and the Soviet Union, but everybody else saying, we're not going to militarize outer space. We're not going to militarize the moon. That was a major decision that could have gone the other way. So that was a very important time. The other thing that you noted is we're still at a period of high risk. And if we look back historically, there were a number of times during the Cold War when there could have been a nuclear exchange. One of the events that always occurs to me was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a Soviet submarine that felt that there were depth charges being dropped outside, assumed that a war had started. There were 3 commanders on the submarine. They all had to agree to launch nuclear weapons. 2 of them said launch, 1 of them said don't launch. There could have been a nuclear exchange right then in October of 1962. So a very challenging time. And of course, now we have more players that have nuclear weapons than we did in 1962. Okay, we've got a couple of questions here, and let me go to the chat. So here's a question from my friend Alex, is asking about the Iranian situation and asking really, how do you see the differences between the way if you can comment on this, the Trump administration approached Iran, and of course coming in and terminating the JCPOA, and how the Biden administration seems to be approaching Iran? Yes.
Do you want me to answer one by one?
Yeah, go ahead if you care to.
Okay. No, I mean, JCPOA, our position has always been that it was, very important success of diplomacy. In order for for that agreement to be preserved, even after the U.S. withdrawal, we always encourage all the other parties to maintain obligations under that agreement. Now, of course, one thing led to the next, and Iran is not fully implementing the obligations. So, we have been always consistently calling on Iran to return to full compliance. Now, with the recent trip of my colleague Rafael Grossi, Director General of IAEA, to Tehran, they have, Rafael has secured a tentative extension of a voluntary implementation by Iran, during which we hope to be able to have good direct negotiation platform to be established between the two countries, with a facilitation by our European colleagues. Now, we believe that there is only one way of resolving these issues, which is negotiation and diplomacy. And I think, in order for that to start, there will have to be a good environment that is conducive to negotiations and discussions. And now I think is a time where we are trying to prepare that ground and environment conducive for discussions. So we will see, if we are actually pushed to a situation where JCPOA is completely collapsed, then we don't know what will follow. One thing is about Iran, but we also need to think about the region itself. One of the important changed, environment of today is that different regions with all sorts of very complicated tensions and conflicts are also the areas where the nuclear overtone is actually behind all these conflicts. So we need to be mindful of that, in order for us to be able to contain the nuclear proliferation issues, as well as also the regional stability and security issues. And so the issues are very complicated. And of course, there are issues related to Iran's role in the regional conflicts in a few locations. So it's very, very complicated. But we maintain that negotiation, diplomacy, and dialogue will be the best way to resolve those issues. And we're committed to facilitating whatever we could to help.
Very good. We have a question about something I didn't realize, because this happened yesterday. Apparently, the UK made an announcement about increasing their nuclear stockpile cap. I don't know if you, and this is a question from Polly von Alsten, who's SFS 1994. So I don't know if you have a comment on that or something you'd like to say.
Yes. For now, I will only simply express a bit of concern, but I actually do have a meeting with the UK colleagues tomorrow, where they will walk me through in details, what they are coming up with. There is a public report which is more than 100 pages, which I have not read, that was just released. I understand that the ceiling, which used to be 180, is now going to be increased. It's not but I understand that the UK government has said that the new figure of 240 is not a target, it's a ceiling. And so I will leave it at that for now. I don't want to say anything inaccurate before I have a full understanding of this. But indeed, it's been widely reported, both in the UK, but now internationally.
Well, thank you, Polly, for bringing that question, and good luck with the meeting. Hopefully that will be enlightening. Dan Fisher Owens asks a question, and this is really presenting the tension that is in the NPT to some degree, is that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty prohibited the proliferation of nuclear weapons to non-nuclear weapon states. the powers that had nuclear weapons nonetheless committed to disarmament at some point. That hasn't happened. And the question is it a challenge for nuclear weapon states to tell other states not to proliferate or not to develop weapon systems when they themselves have it? So how do you sort of conceptualize that, and how does maybe the UN manage that question?
No, actually, we don't manage that question, but it's ingrained. It's really the sort of vision of the NPT treaty itself. The NPT has 3 pillars. One pillar is, of course, a non-proliferation obligation by countries that did not have nuclear weapons. They undertook to commit that they are not going to acquire nuclear weapons. But their peaceful uses of nuclear energy is guaranteed. And, you know, against that background, nuclear weapon states actually also had, you know, under the NPT, has a legal obligation to pursue nuclear disarmament. That's Article 6. Now, I mentioned the TPNW, the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The background to that treaty being adopted was the frustration by non-nuclear weapon states that under the NPT, nuclear weapon states were not fulfilling their obligations. And that's probably an accurate characterization. You know, nuclear disarmament was progressing, and that movement stalled, and it's not making a progress. So there is definitely a very strong frustration on the part of non-nuclear weapon states that have undertook a commitment not to seek nuclear weapons. Now, Article 6 of NPT actually says, they are supposed to, pursue negotiations in good faith for nuclear disarmament. Interestingly, I think it was, Tony, you probably know it better than I do, but International Court of Justice.
I was just thinking of that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. They had an advisory opinion, I think it was 96. They actually, I mean, this advisory opinion said, 7 or 8 interesting things, but one of them was that they have, these nuclear weapon states under the Article 6 of the treaty has to undertake, negotiations in good faith on effective measures, actually and then bring these negotiations to conclusion. So it was not a commitment that nuclear weapon states undertook under the NPT just to continue talking, but they have a legal obligation to bring to conclusion the disarmament measures. So that's how NPT is constructed. It's quite a well-balanced treaty. Some people call it grand bargain. Under the grand bargain, those countries who committed not to pursue nuclear weapon states will be guaranteed that they will actually be one day and hopefully soon elimination of nuclear weapons. And so that's where we are. And as I said, it's not progressing as we thought it should.
You mentioned that decision by the International Court of Justice. I have my class reading that decision, and it was a very strange decision. There was a lot of, as you point, a lot of interesting points that came out, but the fundamental question was, the court was said, is the use of nuclear weapons ever lawful? And the court said, we don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. They said, we can't say it's lawful, but we can't say it's unlawful. And it frustrated so many people. A lot of people said, well, the court shouldn't have even taken the case because they were going to come out and say, we don't know. One question you mentioned, this is something very important in the NPT, is the guarantee for the peaceful development of nuclear power. This has been an area where many countries have proceeded in that direction, but a lot of countries have backed off of it. And the Fukushima disaster and the Chernobyl disaster and 3 Mile Island in this country have raised questions. Is that something you see as a potential area of development? Is the peaceful use of nuclear weapons for energy something that should be pursued? And perhaps are there any efforts on the part of the United Nations to look into that area?
Right. I mean, the peaceful uses actually, goes under the purview of IAEA. And I need to also mention that it's not just the power generation. It's not just nuclear power, but they have, agricultural, I mean, all sorts of different, medical use of nuclear power, etc., energy. So there are different dimensions about peaceful uses. It still is an important issue for global South and developing countries. What I would like to see more in that field is a better linkage with, accelerated implementation of sustainable development goals. Not to be just only focused on nuclear power plants, but there must be other areas where nuclear energy will be quite useful. But for us, the important point that we need to emphasize, repeatedly, is that, as someone said, from the audience, nuclear non-proliferation obligations and nuclear disarmament obligations are two sides of the same coin. So nuclear weapon states cannot say to non-nuclear weapon states, well, we're going to continue to have nuclear weapons forever, but you have to continue to have a commitment for non-proliferation. That's not going to work, unfortunately.
Let me ask, we're coming to the end of our time, but let me ask sort of a final question. And you may or may not be able to comment on this, but recent reports indicate that North Korea may be potentially testing an intercontinental ballistic missile. As we know, conclusions are that they clearly possess weapons capability. They possess certain missile capability. The question is, can they marry the two and have a nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile? Personally, find it very disturbing. And any comments you might have on that, or the way we should sort of think about the potential development there?
Absolutely. I mean, for us, and probably for all of us, DPRK issue is one of the most challenging issues. Here again, we believe that the best method will be negotiation and dialogue. We need to also focus on risk reductions. We have to make sure that, nothing really bad will happen in that region. After it's my region as well. But you touched on a very important issue, which is a link between nuclear weapons capabilities and also the development of missile capabilities. Now, in various fields of disarmament, missile is one area that we do not have a global standard, global norm established. And so that's an area where we need to really start working much, much harder. If you also remember, if you looked at the sort of history of negotiation of JCPOA, which continued for a long time, the missile elements were left out from the JCPOA because it is very, very difficult to secure agreement. So you can see how difficult and complicated missile technologies and missile issues overall are. We don't even have at the international level common understanding of terminologies that are related to missiles. I've experienced in Security Council discussions where different members of Security Councils are using different terminologies. Some call it ballistic missile, some call it otherwise. So, there is a lot of work to be done in the overall area of missiles. So that's one thing, the link between missile issue and nuclear. And another issue is, I think we need to also look at more seriously regionally tailored agreements on nuclear capabilities. In many of those areas, of course, the Northeast Asia, the DPRK, the Korean Peninsula issue, but also Iran, Middle East. But also we have South Asia, India, Pakistan, So we need to actually look at much more seriously, much more closely, the regional specificities of nuclear danger, and then, address all the issues very comprehensively, with a very practical risk reduction measures, all the way to the actual reduction of nuclear arsenals. And then for that, we need obviously a political solution to all of that. So it's a hugely complicated issue.
Well, Izumi, thank you. And the whole issue is extraordinarily complicated, but it's an issue we got to tackle because the future of humanity in many respects is riding on it. Not to overstate the case, but it truly is. Well, let us all thank the Honorable Izumi Nakamitsu for a fantastic conversation and great engagement, wonderful questions. I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to have a special shout out to Kelly Young of the Georgetown University Alumni Association for making all the logistics happen, to Eleanor Monty Jones, who was the Director of Alumni Engagement for the School of Foreign Service and came up with the idea of SFS Online and On Topic. I wish everybody a great day, stay safe, and we'll see you next month. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you, Izumi.